Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're going to look at something today that's probably been on a lot of people's minds lately, and that's the price of oil.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
you've probably seen the headlines about it going up, and, some of us might even remember those times way back when, where, rising oil prices really mess things up in the economy.
Right.
So we've got this really interesting article here. We're calling it Text4, and we're going to
Mm.
kind of dig into it and see, is this current situation with oil prices, is it heading down that same road of economic trouble?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Text4 does a really good job of sort of taking us back to those big oil shocks, right? Back in the
Hmm.
1970s and the early 80s.
Right.
And then it compares that to what we're seeing now, and it really helps us understand, what's pushing these prices up lately.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is the author seems to think that things might actually turn out a bit differently this time around. So it's a really good way to get a grip on, what's going on with oil prices.
Yeah, without getting too bogged down, right, in all the complicated economic theory.
Exactly. Yeah.
So our goal today is pretty straightforward, I think.
Mm.
We just want to understand those main arguments that are laid out in text 4.
Right.
So, why exactly have oil prices jumped recently?
Yeah.
What happened in the past when these prices spiked? Like, what were the consequences?
Uh-huh.
And then, really, I think the most important thing to figure out is why might things play out differently this time around?
Yeah, that's the big question.
So right off the bat, the article jumps into talking about this pretty sharp increase we saw in the price of crude oil.
Yeah.
So, we're talking it went from under $10 a barrel in December to almost $26 in March.
Wow.
And that was after OPEC, which is, that group of oil producing countries,
Right, right.
decided to cut back on how much oil they were actually producing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, less supply usually means higher prices.
Right, basic economics.
Yeah.
But what I found really fascinating here is how the author immediately makes this connection back to, those big oil crises we talked about, like
Yeah.
1973 when prices jumped like 4 times higher.
Right.
And then again in 1979 and 1980 when they almost tripled.
Yeah, those were some pretty turbulent times.
Oh, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, and the author really points out how those events, they weren't just about oil.
Yeah.
They had these like ripple effect throughout the entire global economy.
Absolutely. I mean, they led to some serious inflation. Like we're talking double-digit inflation in a lot of countries.
Right.
And the global economy as a whole really took a hit. It slowed down significantly.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, with prices jumping like this again, are we headed down that same path?
It's a big concern for sure.
And that's really the core question the article is wrestling with, right?
Right.
If this kind of price surge has happened before and it led to, some really negative consequences, why aren't we seeing all these like doom and gloom predictions all over the news?
Exactly. I mean, you'd think people would be freaking out, right?
Yeah, you'd think so. So what's changed?
Well, the article dives into a couple of immediate reasons why prices have spiked this time around.
Right.
So, beyond OPEC cutting back its production, like we talked about,
Right.
Iraq actually suspended its oil exports for a while,
Oh, wow.
which, that obviously put even more strain on the global supply.
Right, right. Less oil on the market.
Exactly. And then on the demand side, you have to factor in that the global economy was actually getting stronger
Uh-huh.
right around the same time that winter hit in the northern hemisphere.
Oh, yeah.
So, more people were using more energy for heating and things like that, which obviously pushes prices up in the short term.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got less oil available and we've got potentially more demand for it, which explains why the price went up.
Right.
But then why isn't everyone like totally panicking about, a major economic downturn like we saw back in the 70s?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting because the author gives us a bunch of reasons why the economic impact might actually be much less severe this time around.
Okay, I'm curious.
Yeah. So the first big point they make is about how much of the price we pay at the pump actually comes from the crude oil itself.
Oh, interesting.
Right. They explain that the cost of that raw crude oil is actually a much smaller part of the final price of petrol in most countries now compared to, back in the 70s.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And they give this example of Europe, where taxes on fuel can be as high as 80%.
Wow.
So like 4 out of every 5 euros that you spend at the pump are actually going towards taxes.
So even if the price of the oil itself goes up a lot, the price at the gas station might not jump up as much because those taxes kind of act like a cushion.
Right, exactly. It's like a shock absorber.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So that's one reason why the impact might be less this time. The second big reason they give is that, these richer countries, they're just not as dependent on oil as they used to be.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a household that's diversified its investments,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
If one area takes a hit, the whole portfolio isn't wiped out.
Right. And the article talks about how over the past few decades, there's been this real shift in how these economies work.
Uh-huh.
So, we've got these efforts to save energy, which have made a difference.
Right.
And there's been this move towards using different types of fuel.
Yeah, like renewables and things like that.
Exactly. But I think the biggest change they talk about is the types of industries that are now really important in a lot of these rich countries.
Oh, that makes sense.
Like back in the 70s, you had these big, heavy industries that were just guzzling oil.
Right, like manufacturing and stuff.
Yeah, like the article mentions steel making and car manufacturing.
Uh-huh.
But now you've got these sectors like software development, consulting, all those things, mobile phones.
Right, and those industries don't need nearly as much energy to run.
Exactly. It's like comparing, I don't know, like a factory town to Silicon Valley or something.
Yeah, totally different energy needs.
And the article really backs this up with some hard numbers.
Okay.
So they highlight that rich economies now use almost 50% less oil for every dollar of GDP.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It's a lot. And just to remind everyone, GDP is basically the total value of everything a country produces.
Right, right.
So that's a big reduction in how much these economies actually need oil to function.
Yeah, it shows they've really diversified their energy sources.
And the article even mentions this estimate from the OECD, which is that group of developed countries.
Right.
And their economic outlook predicted that even if oil prices averaged $22 a barrel for a whole year,
Okay.
which, that's compared to just $13 back in 1998,
Right.
it would only increase how much these countries spend on importing oil by, like, a pretty small amount, somewhere between 0.25 and 0.5% of their total GDP.
Oh, okay. So it wouldn't be a devastating blow to their economies.
Exactly. And here's the key point. The article stresses that this potential loss is less than a quarter of what happened back in 1974 and 1980.
Wow.
So it really shows how much less vulnerable those richer economies are now to these sudden spikes in oil prices.
Yeah, they've built up a lot of resilience.
But the article does throw in a bit of a warning here,
Okay.
especially when it comes to these oil importing emerging economies.
Yeah.
Because as those, heavy energy intensive industries have shifted to these countries, they've actually become more dependent on energy.
Oh, right.
So they could face some bigger challenges if those prices keep going up.
Yeah, that makes sense. They haven't had the same opportunity to diversify their economies.
Right. So it's not necessarily good news for everyone.
So it's kind of a mixed bag depending on where you are in the world.
Right. Exactly. Now, the third major reason the article gives for why we might not see that same economic meltdown is the bigger picture of commodity prices. So it seems like this oil price rise isn't happening at a time when prices for other raw materials are also skyrocketing.
Oh, interesting.
And there's not this sense of, huge global demand across the board, which was a really big factor in the 1970s.
Yeah, those oil shocks back then were happening alongside a lot of other economic turmoil.
Right, exactly. And the article really emphasizes that a lot of countries are still recovering from those economic slowdowns.
Uh-huh.
To illustrate this point, they mention the Economist's Commodity Price Index, which, that tracks prices for a whole bunch of raw materials.
Right.
And it hasn't really changed that much from last year.
Oh, so it's been pretty stable.
Yeah. And that's really different from what happened in the 70s, because the article points out that commodity prices jumped by a whopping 70% in 1973,
Wow.
and then almost 30% in 1979.
Yeah, those are massive increases.
So it seems like this time this oil price increase is kind of a one-off, rather than being part of this, bigger trend where everything's getting more expensive.
Right. It's not like we're seeing runaway inflation across the board.
Exactly. And that lack of, general commodity price inflation.
Yeah.
It's a big reason why economists aren't necessarily predicting that we're going back to those really high levels of overall inflation that we saw back then.
Right. It suggests that the impact of this oil price rise might be more contained.
So if we kind of put all of this together, it seems like the author of Text4 is basically saying that while this increase in oil prices is definitely worth keeping an eye on,
Yeah.
it's probably not going to cause the same kind of widespread economic chaos that we saw in the 70s.
Right. It's definitely something to watch, but it's not necessarily time to panic.
Okay, so let's recap. What have we learned from this deep dive into Text 4?
Okay.
Well, it seems like while the jump in oil prices might be giving some of us flashbacks to, those past economic troubles,
Right.
the reality is that things are pretty different today.
Yeah.
Richer countries just don't need oil as much as they used to. And this price increase isn't happening in this environment where, everything is getting crazy expensive.
Exactly. The underlying conditions are quite different.
So, yeah, we might see some effects, but it's probably not going to be a repeat of those crises from the 70s.
Hopefully, this conversation has kind of given you a better understanding of why we're not seeing all these doom and gloom headlines.
Right.
Even though oil prices are going up, it really shows that you need to look at the bigger picture, and not just focus on those top line numbers.
And I think, thinking about those emerging economies that are now more dependent on energy,
Yeah.
it really raises this interesting question. How are those countries adapting to these higher prices?
Uh-huh.
And what kind of long-term strategies are they putting in place to manage that vulnerability?
That's a really good question.
It makes you wonder if the next big economic shifts are going to be felt most strongly in those parts of the world, in those rapidly developing economies.
It's definitely something to think about.
It's definitely food for thought. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
It's been a pleasure.